Hi, my name is Alex Dolphin and welcome back to another episode of Ex Ante. Today we're going to discuss the case United States v. Booker. This case was heard in the Supreme Court of the United States in the year 2005. Let's go ahead and jump into the facts of the case. Facts are fairly simple. The defendant, Mr. Booker, was charged with and convicted of federal crime, federal drug crime, possession with the intent to distribute crack cocaine. And the amount that he was charged and convicted of was 50 grams. So there's these things in United States criminal law called federal sentencing guidelines. And before this case, these guidelines were mandatory. Judges had to impose a sentence within the guidelines set by these sentencing guidelines. So for the crime that Mr. Booker was convicted of, the guidelines gave him a range of 210 to 262 months. Very high. Federal drug crime sentencing guidelines are very high. But before the judge ultimately sentenced Mr. Booker, the judge considered some facts that were not found by the jury. And this is where it begins to become problematic. And the judge finds some facts, namely that Mr. Booker actually had a significantly larger amount of crack cocaine that he was possessing, in the hundreds of grams, over 600 grams of cocaine. And so based upon that fact that the judge unilaterally found by his or herself, ultimately, Mr. Booker was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison for this crime. Well, Mr. Booker appeals this, and he says, this isn't right. The judge can't find this fact without the jury. I was deprived of my Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial. And the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals agrees with Mr. Booker, says, Judge, sorry, the fact-finding role is one for the jury. And the fact that you decided to find this fact, that does not work. The judge can't unilaterally find facts for the sentence because that deprives the defendant of their Sixth Amendment right. So this gets appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. There's two main questions. The first is, did Mr. Booker's sentence, in essence, one where the judge found facts that were not found by the jury and then used those facts to sentence a criminal defendant to a higher sentence in federal prison, is that constitutional, right? And Justice Stevens answers that question. There's two majority opinions here. And for the first question, Justice Stevens answers it. He says, no, the judge can't do this. Every criminal defendant has a right to trial by jury for every element of their offense, and it needs to be proved beyond a reasonable doubt to the jury. And when the judge just unilaterally saw, well, hey, there's, more crack cocaine and I see it, so now I'm going to impose a higher sentence based on the fact that I see it, that's unconstitutional. A judge can't do that. So that's the first holding. And the second holding is really what this case is known for. And that opinion is written by Justice Breyer. And essentially what it says is, because if these mandatory guidelines are, or if these guidelines, these sentencing guidelines are mandatory, well, then it's not constitutional, because judges are kind of forced to consider these facts by themselves in sentencing. And if the statute forces them to consider facts that aren't really found by the jury, there's this mess, and it's a violation of the Sixth Amendment. And so for that reason, we're going to say that, even though Congress said, hey, you want these guidelines, these sentencing guidelines to be mandatory on the judge, we're not going to make them mandatory. We're going to strike that and say that these guidelines are only advisory. And in practice, this has a vast difference, right? Because essentially what it did is it got rid of all mandatory minimums for federal crimes. In a sense, you're saying that, well, the guidelines say you need to be sentenced to 210 months, but if the judge finds factors that, might sway their opinion, well, the judge could sentence the defendant to something significantly lower than that guideline range. It gives vast discretion. The ruling in Booker gives vast discretion to the district courts, and the appellate review standard is just reasonableness. So the appellate court, if either side doesn't like the sentence, basically just has to say that was unreasonable, and that's a very great deference is given to the district court in sentencing. So that's the case. You see a massive change in the federal sentencing law. Congress passed a law that was giving these guidelines. And Congress did this because they wanted, the same defendants to be treated similarly throughout the country. They didn't want judges in California to be sentencing differently than judges in Alabama. They wanted, if you commit a federal crime, you're going to be sentenced in accord with these guidelines. And the court says, well, you can't make them mandatory because that violates the Sixth Amendment. Well, the impact of this case is just huge, right? Because and before I jump into the full analysis, first, I think you can agree with the outcome, which is that, we shouldn't have these mandatory sentencing guidelines. But you can also disagree with the process. And this question wasn't really necessarily before the court. The court kind of did perform a bit of judicial overreach, in my opinion, in striking down all of the federal sentencing guidelines as mandatory. Congress passed this law. Congress passed these sentencing guidelines and said we want them to be mandatory. And it wasn't really the court's role in this case to go so far as to striking down the mandatory nature of all these guidelines. I think that's definitely a debate. But the outcome, I think people can generally agree that the outcome is good because it allows judges to consider multiple factors in sentencing and allow them to really, see and discern what that defendant was up to, what kind of time they deserve in jail, and perhaps allow more justice there. And now the flip side of that, and what a lot of people might argue, and what the Department of Justice has argued, is that this has led to more disparity in sentencing, right? And you could see why. Well, if you have judges that basically are allowed to determine the sentencing without any type of rigid guideline that they have to adhere to, well, then judges are going to have the opportunity to, maybe sentence a white person to less time than a black person. You could see how that might happen when these guidelines are really persuasive and guiding rather than mandatory. And so it might lead to more disparity in the treatment of criminal defendants. And that's the downside. Well, the upside might be, as I said earlier, it might allow us more justice in instances. It might allow criminal defendants where, largely the law is out of line with society's opinion of these crimes, right? Maybe if you're convicted of distributing some type of controlled substance like marijuana or even, cocaine, these guidelines might, like Booker got, 30 years in federal prison for distributing those drugs. And I think largely society's morality has veered away from that, where we see, are we really supposed to be locking people in cages for selling drugs or for just, possessing them and using them, or should we perhaps allow them to be rehabilitated through a different system? And this allows judges to say, hey, we're not going to throw this person in a cage for 30 years. Maybe we'll put them in federal prison for a year or two, let them think about their mistake, and then have them be on probation for 4 or 5 years. And so this Booker ruling does really give a lot of deference and allows a district court to kind of impose sentences which are more in tune with society's morality. Now, there's also a problematic thing there where you say, well, is the judge really the arbiter of society's morality? Or is Congress a better arbiter of society's morality as an elected legislature? And I think that's an interesting debate. If you have any thoughts, go ahead and leave them in the comments section. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and I hope you have a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye.